want to say again, it's Victoria Giparsley speaking. You'll see my name come up as Lauren Crawford because I am using his host account until I get my own, which I think will be happening soon enough. And I'm here with Morna Valentine, who has been working, well, here, maybe I'll turn my camera on just so people can see what I look like for at least a few seconds. Hi, everybody. Some of you may not be able to see the video, and that's fine. Because you'll be listening to Morna speak and then looking at the slides that she's going to be showing as part of her PowerPoint presentation, and that's the most important thing. Morna has been working with us for several months on the RAND campaign. This webinar is called Why Do Conservatives Want to Take Away the RAND Formula, and What Is It Anyway? And I'm going to flip to a slide here that's just going to give you a bit of an overview of what this webinar is going to talk about. And just so you know, it's going to last about 45 minutes. And in terms of questions, you're welcome to ask questions as we go along. My job is going to be to monitor them. And if it seems like the question is needed at the time for clarification, we'll certainly answer it on our way. If it can be saved till the end, we'll do that. So Morna will sort of make that decision as we go along. We just had another webinar at 7 o'clock Ottawa time, and we had about 70 people on that call. So it's wonderful that we're getting such great participation in these webinars, and certainly we're going to be doing more of them. So in terms of this webinar, this is about union rights of workers, including members of the PSAC, and that those union rights are under threat. That thousands of jobs have been lost because of the federal government's budget priorities, and that some Conservatives and some employer organizations want Parliament to legislate away union rights. And one of these rights is the right of workers to have independent and financially viable unions through the RAND formula. And this webinar focuses very much on the RAND formula and some other attacks that we're seeing coming through the federal government right now. So I think what I will do, just to repeat, that if you can use the chat function to ask any questions, not the Q&A section, that would be great. And I am going to check and see if people can't hear what I'm saying. I've got a couple of messages saying that people aren't hearing, just one in fact, so I'll follow up on that. But I think what I'll do is I'll hand it over to Morna I'll turn off my camera, because you don't need to see me anymore, that's for sure. And I will then hand it over to Morna, who can turn her camera on, and we'll let you do that. And let me just do this. Bye, everybody. There we go. Okay, Morna, can you go ahead and turn your camera on, and I'll... Oh, I'm going to pass you the ball. Sorry about that. I haven't hosted many webinars. It's sort of new to me, so... I might have to give you my computer. What's going on here? Oh, just a second. There we go. Sorry. All right. Voila. There. So I've just passed control over to Morna, and she's going to now take over.
Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. For some of you, it might be already late evening, and for some of you, it's probably the day is just ending, or the end of the workday. Workday is just ending. But it's great that so many of you were able to be part of this webinar. As Victoria said, we're going to be focusing on the RAND formula. What is it? Where did it come from? And why do they want to take it away from us? So I'm going to try to get through these slides fairly quickly. We've got a 45-minute time limit. As Victoria said, please use the chat function. Ask questions. If you want to interrupt at any point and have your question looked at, send that signal to Victoria or to me. So I'll try to move along as quickly as possible. So first let's just talk about what the RAND formula is, and it's very simply is a provision in a collective agreement or in labor law that says that all workers who are covered by a collective agreement, in other words, all workers who are part of a certified bargaining unit, must contribute to the cost of union representation. The RAND formula is a uniquely Canadian invention. It was put into place for the first time in 1945, And it is called the RAND formula because it was a RAND formula that was developed by a Supreme Court justice named Ivan Rand, who was appointed through an agreement of Ford Motor Company and what was the auto workers at the Ford Motor Company in Windsor, Ontario, then represented by the United Auto Workers, which, as many of you know, became in Canada the Canadian Auto Workers. Justice Ivan Rand was appointed to arbitrate this dispute between the Ford Motor Company and the auto workers, which was largely a dispute and eventually a strike that lasted 99 days. And it was primarily over the issue of what we call union security. So in 1945, it was just after the Second World War, and during the war, the federal government actually passed what was called then, because it was actually kind of like a war measure, an ordinance which gave right to workers in Canada to organize. And one of the reasons the federal government at the time gave workers the right to organize into unions legally and to force employers to recognize workers who wanted to organize unions is because during the war there had been some strikes, and particularly wildcat strikes and disputes in a number of really important ammunition and other plants related to the war industry. And so to try to achieve industrial and labor peace, the federal government agreed to introduce legislation that was very much modeled on U.S. labor legislation, which gave the right to workers to organize, forced employers to recognize unions when workers decided by majority to form unions, and in exchange, in the law, workers were not allowed to wildcat or strike during the term of the collective agreement. So in the case of the Ford Motor Company in 1945, this right to organize in Canada was a relatively new right. And what the union wanted to achieve through collective bargaining, what the workers wanted to achieve through collective bargaining, was a provision in the collective agreement that said that all employees hired by the Ford Motor Company who were working at the plant would have to join the union after a period of time, like after the probationary period was ended. And the Ford Motor Company refused to allow for this provision. Of course, the union wanted to make sure that all the workers were part of the union so that the union can maintain industrial strength and make gains for everybody. And also the argument was, well, if the union has to negotiate and represent all workers in the certified bargaining unit, then all workers who get benefit from the collective agreement should be members of the union and pay union dues. So this was the main issue and dispute in this famous Ford strike. As I say, it lasted a long time. There was a long period of bargaining, then 99 days of strike. And eventually, Ford and the union agreed that they would have a settlement to the strike arbitrated, that they agreed to binding arbitration. And the Supreme Court justice, it wasn't a Supreme Court that was appointed. Ivan Rand happened to be a member of the Supreme Court, but he was appointed to arbitrate. The parties agreed that he would arbitrate the dispute. And on the question of union security, what he ended up saying and deciding and arbitrating was that the workers should not be forced to join a union, that should not actually be a condition of employment at the Ford Motor Company. But on the other hand, whether a bargaining unit member joined the union or not, the worker should have to pay union dues, and also the employer would have to collect those dues on behalf of the union and then hand over the dues check to the union. So that was a right that was won through this arbitrated settlement in 1945, and as I say, named the RAND formula because it was a formula sort of seen as a compromise of not all workers who are covered by a collective agreement have to join a union, but all workers covered by a collective agreement have to pay their freight, pay and contribute towards the costs of union representation. Justice Rand spoke in his decision, his 1945 Ford decision. He spoke about the social desirability of collective bargaining and that has been now written into statute. In other words, we have labor laws we have a law that gives workers the right to organize labor unions, but he said labor unions therefore have to be strong in order to carry out the functions for which they were intended. So he was adamant that unions, to be able to represent workers, needed the financial means to do so, and that could only be achieved through a mandatory dues checkoff. And since 1945, this RAND formula, this mandatory dues checkoff that all members of the bargaining unit have to pay, has become a labor relations standard. The RAND formula exists in all of PSAC collective agreements, and most labor laws, including the Canada Labor Code, say that the RAND formula has to be included in the collective agreement at the request of the union. Now, interestingly enough, one major piece of labor legislation, the Public Service Labor Relations Act, which covers the vast majority of PSAC members, does not include any reference to the RAND formula. In fact, it doesn't include any reference to dues, except for minor references that are kind of irrelevant to the discussion tonight. But what the PSAC did from its very first collective agreement negotiated under the Public Service Labor Relations Act, or under the federal legislation giving federal government workers the right to organize, from the very first collective agreement, the PSAC has included the RAND formula. And, just to note that the RAND formula is a provision of the PSAC collective agreement, but certainly the federal government collective agreement has been negotiated and renegotiated by both conservative governments and liberal governments over time. Just want to note that one of the reasons why a number of labor laws state that the RAND formula has to be included in collective agreements at the request of the union is to eliminate or to make unnecessary the kind of strike that took place at the Ford Motor Company back in 1945. In other words, what legislatures have said is that it doesn't make any sense that workers should have to go out and strike to be able to secure financial security and union security for the union. That should not be a matter of a strike action. And that's why if a union, under most labor laws, if a union wants the RAND formula in the collective agreement, the employer has to give it. That is not the case for unions that represent workers under the Public Service Labor Relations Act, but all federal unions under that act have negotiated the RAND formula as part of our union security clauses. So why do workers need the RAND formula? Well, very simply, it's the fairest way to share the costs of union representation. The argument is that all workers in a unionized workplace have the legal right to union representation and that they get all the benefits of a collective agreement. It makes sense that they all share the costs of that representation. The RAND formula, of course, and mandatory dues and the dues checkoff system also give unions the financial security that are needed to represent the interests of workers. And this helps redress the imbalance that exists between employees and employers, because most employers, like the federal government, have much more money and many more resources than employees do. So the mandatory dues checkoff, the RAND formula, is a way to try to level the playing field between employers and the union, both with respect to collective bargaining and with respect to representation around grievances, and also in other spheres of life, like the political arena and the social arena, that the RAND formula helps make sure, for example, that unions are able to represent workers to parliamentary committees and in the media and so forth. So why do some employers and politicians hate the RAND formula? Well, for exactly the same reasons that we like it. They hate it because it gives unions the financial security needed to represent the interests of workers, and they hate it because it helps redress the imbalance between employees and employers. But of course, that's not what they say. Those who are trying to get rid of the RAND formula would never say that it's because they hate unions. or they hate workers. Well, some might say that, but that's not the kind of message that they put out. What they say instead is they say things like, well, workers should have the right to choose. We don't like mandatory dues. Dues should be optional. It's an issue of choice. They also make the argument that, there shouldn't be mandatory dues because if unions are doing a good job, workers would choose to pay. So optional dues, as opposed to mandatory dues, they say is a way of keeping unions honest and effective. They say this is really not about anti-unionism, this is just about democracy and accountability. Now, of course, when you hear those arguments, and what we need to encourage our coworkers to think about when they hear those arguments, and those arguments are being made all the time in the media and in Parliament these days, we have to keep in mind who are these people who are making these arguments. Well, they're employer organizations primarily, not all employer organizations, but some main employer organizations like Merit Canada, which has as a self-proclaimed mission, you can check the website for Merit Canada, its mission in life is actually to restrict the power of workers, and they want to expand the number of union-free workplaces. This is an organization, by the way, that was really created to try to rid the construction sector, the construction industry, of unions. But these days, Merit Canada seems to be spending a lot more time and paying a lot more attention to public sector workers than it is construction workers. Other people who are making these arguments, pretending to be the great defenders of workers and of democracy, are politicians like Tim Hudak, the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, or Pierre Poilievre, who's a member of Parliament for Nippy and Carleton. Both these politicians and others who have been advocating for the end of the RAND formula are the same politicians who have also been advocating to worsen the working conditions of public sector workers in particular, but all workers generally, and they want to take away benefits. So when we hear these arguments of democracy, we really have to take into account who's doing that talking and whether or not these arguments are at all credible. If you ask PSAC members, if you ask workers themselves what they think about the RAND formula, and a recent survey that we conducted of PSAC members, 85% say they support it. So while employer organizations and some conservative politicians might be saying that, this goes against workers' democracy and its mission of choice, in fact, most union members think it's a good thing. And why do they think it's a good thing? Well, there are two arguments that are very persuasive for workers with respect to the RAND formula. First of all, the vast majority of workers believe that taking away the RAND formula is, in fact, part of a long-term strategy of weakening their rights and their unions. And PSAC members in the recent survey I was talking about said clearly that they don't want that. And another thing that workers are really concerned about is that if you take away the RAND formula and you make dues optional and some members stop paying, those members who don't stop paying, who continue to pay, will end up paying the freight for those that don't. In other words, they say taking away the RAND formula is giving them a license for free riding, and that's neither fair and nor democratic. And these are two very powerful arguments that counter the rhetoric of employer organizations like Merit Canada, who say taking the RAND formula is a good thing because it's all about helping workers. That's not, in fact, what workers themselves believe, and that's not what they're saying. And workers have every reason to be very skeptical about taking away the RAND formula, and they have every reason to believe and they understand that really it's about weakening workers' rights and unions, because if we look to the South and to the United States of America, we've seen concretely being able to study what it means to not have mandatory dues. So one of the things it means in the United States is there are a lot fewer unions and the level of unionization is much lower. In states in the U.S. that have gotten rid of the mandatory dues system have actually made mandatory dues illegal. In those states, unionization levels have dropped to less than 5%. Workers in those situations don't even have the choice of becoming unionized because unionization is just not possible. In the United States, we've seen that when you eliminate mandatory dues, the unions just simply no longer have the resources to defend members. And as I said, what happens is that the members who do keep paying dues end up feeling incredibly resentful of the members who don't pay the union dues. And then because the union has to continue to provide legal representation to workers who don't pay dues, the dues of those who are paying go up because to make up for the lost revenue. And so it makes a difficult situation even worse for those who continue to pay dues, and a number of workers end up not being able to continue to pay the additional dues money, and so they drop out, and so forth, and it's a vicious cycle. And as a result of all of this, what we've seen in the United States is when you introduce right-to-work legislation, when you eliminate mandatory dues, the immediate impact is that wages and benefits fall and drop significantly. So if we compare, and the other big issue is, of course, this does damage not just to the rights and benefits of unionized workers, it also does a lot of damage to workers who are not part of unions. So when you look at the working conditions of workers, whether they're in unions or not unions, in the so-called right-to-work states where it is illegal to negotiate a mandatory dues provision or a union security provision, in those states, workers overall have much lower wages. They have much lower benefit and worse benefit coverage and health care coverage. They have inferior pension benefits. And by the way, they also have a much higher incidence of workplace injury. Now, in Canada, we have some really strong legal arguments in favor of the RAND formula. In fact, the Supreme Court has considered the issue of RAND formula, and they specifically tried to address the question that was put to them a number of years ago by a union member, a dissatisfied and disaffected union member, who said that mandatory dues was a violation of his charter rights, his freedom of association rights. And so this complaint that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court gave an opportunity for the Supreme Court to pronounce itself on a number of issues related to the RAND formula and union rights in the context of the Charter of the Canadian Constitution. And the Supreme Court justices, there were a number of different opinions on this, but the court ruled against the complainant in this case and made a very clear statement that to do away with the RAND formula would seriously undermine a union's financial base and, in fact, undermine the underpinnings of unionism. And this is important because subsequently the Supreme Court has also ruled that collective bargaining and the right to unionize is actually protected right under the Charter. And so laws that undermine unions and collective bargaining are effectively illegal. So there's strong, as I said, legal arguments against doing away with the RAND formula. I would say the law is on our side. More importantly, the Charter of Rights is on our side. Now, the support for the RAND formula is, in fact, so strong, and the arguments in favor of the RAND formula and against taking it away are so strong that our sense now is that conservatives, certainly at the federal level, are starting to shift to a more sideways legislative attack on unions rather than the full frontal attack on the RAND formula. And we see just evidence of that. Bill C-377, private members bill, which was passed by the House of Commons and which is now in front of the Senate. And thankfully the Liberal senators are committed to try to stall this law for as long as possible. This law was passed by the House of Commons, a private member's bill, which forces extraordinary and onerous reporting requirements on unions. Again, evidence that conservatives are determined to set their sights on unions, even if it's not a direct attack on RAND. Then very recently, just 2 weeks ago, we saw the introduction of another private member's bill, this time by Blaine Calkins, a member of Parliament from Alberta, a Conservative member of Parliament, a backbencher who introduced Bill C-525. And that legislation proposes to make it a lot more difficult for workers under federal labor jurisdiction, for workers who are governed by the Canada Labour Code, or federal employees who are covered by the Public Service Labour Relations Act, or by the Parliamentary Employee Staff Relations Act. Workers who are covered by this federal jurisdiction would find it much more difficult to organize into unions, and it will become much easier for unions to become decertified even when a minority of workers request decertification and even when a minority of workers actually vote for decertification. So under this law, astonishingly, to be able to withstand a demand for decertification under the Public Service Labour Relations Act, 56% of the members of the bargaining unit would have to vote in favor of retaining their union rights. So it's clearly an anti-democratic measure where the decision is not even made by the majority of those voting, or even majority of the bargaining unit would require 56% of the bargaining unit to vote in favor of the union for the union to remain certified. So it's really astonishing in the private members bill. And then thirdly, we're expecting the introduction of another private members bill maybe after the summer recess in the fall, when the next group of 15 backbenchers and private members get called up we've given an opportunity to introduce legislation, private members legislation in the House. We expect that. We're watching very closely an MP by the name of Rob Anders, again from Alberta, who was active in the National Citizens Coalition in Alberta and actually headed up an organization in Alberta which lobbied very strongly and almost got legislation passed in Alberta which would have taken away the RAND formulas. We're watching him closely. He's second on the list to introduce legislation after the summer recess, and we expect that the kind of legislation these Conservatives are now looking at is legislation that would restrict and control what unions can do with their dues money, and specifically it would prohibit the use of dues for spending, for addressing issues in the political arena, and that's what we think is likely to be introduced in the fall. I just want to mention that Merit Canada, this employer organization, a few weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago, the head of it, Terence Oakey, made a speech to the Economic Club of Canada in which he said that we would soon be seeing legislation that would make it more difficult to organize and would eliminate what we call automatic certification or card check at the federal level. And a week later, that's exactly what happened with the introduction of 525. Well, in that same speech, he said that we would soon see legislation introduced, which he called workers' choice legislation, which would effectively be a law that would make it illegal for unions to use any money collected through the mandatory dues structure through the RAND formula on political or social issues. So the threat of that is very real. And of course, all of these measures constitute government interference in the undermining of workers' rights and of their union rights. Senator Cohen, who is the leader, the leader of the opposition in the Senate, spoke I think it was yesterday in the Senate about really the hypocrisy and of the current government that claims to be in favor of transparency, that refuses to be transparent when it comes to its own business, but demands transparency of private organizations, but more specifically and uniquely of unions. So what can we do about all of this? Well, the PSAC has a plan, and many of you, I hope, will know about this plan and already be engaged. But first most major point of the plan is to actually involve PSAC members, workers themselves, and encourage them to speak out on these issues. The Conservative government, these Conservative members of Parliament, these employer organizations love to talk about how rank-and-file union members are not supportive of their union, that rank-and-file union members would love not to have to pay dues, that the only people who really believe in dues and in mandatory dues are the union bosses. And what we need to do is make it clear that that's not the case. We know from our own polling that that's not the case, but a poll is not good enough. Folks who live in BC will know that for sure, given that the polls were certainly wrong in predicting the outcome of the last provincial election. So a poll is all very fine, but what we really need is voices and of members to get out there and for members themselves to speak out on these issues. An important part of our plan is to put pressure on Cabinet to reject these private members' bills. Private members' bills don't get anywhere through the parliamentary system without the active support of government. And that's particularly true of private members' bills being introduced by conservative backbenchers. We know that if the Prime Minister's office does not want to see a conservative private members' bill introduced, the Prime Minister's office has a lot of control and power to stop it from happening. And what we want to do is make sure that the Cabinet distances itself as much as possible, we want to force it to actually oppose these private members' bills. It's going to be particularly important over the summer months to put pressure on members of the government, the ministers who sit in government, to get them to speak out and say that they would not support Bill C-525, for example. Part of our plan is to work closely with other unions at all levels, both federal government employee unions, the other unions that we work with and many of our members work side by side with, but also unions in the private sector through labor councils, through federations of labor at the provincial and territorial level, and also, of course, nationally and in Quebec. And to get media attention and organize other voices to speak on our behalf. So it's not just unions defending unions, but civil society defending unions as well. What can you do personally? We want you to volunteer to be a campaigner in a huge, exciting initiative that we've got underway, which is to speak in face-to-face conversations with every PSAC member. And that means recruiting about 7,500 activists who are willing to go and speak to about 20 other co-workers about these issues and to convince them to sign a pledge card saying that we support our collective agreement rights, we support collective bargaining, we support our union, and also these pledge cards are a way to get contact information for every member so that we can continue to engage members in everything that we do as a union, particularly over the next few years as the collective bargaining, big collective rounds of collective bargaining get underway, which we know are going to be extremely difficult as the government has already indicated they're going to try to take away sick leave, they're putting in place a new pay system unilaterally, and they want to put in a new performance management, which will just be an excuse to get rid of people at their discretion and just no doubt in a discriminatory and arbitrary way. So the other thing you do is make your own voices heard, call and write to your members of parliament. I want to also add to this, call your senators, particularly Liberal senators. They are, as I said, that they're pretty determined to try to keep up this fight. We need to encourage them to do this on Bill 377. And so figure out who your senator is, pick up the phone and call the senator, write the senator, email the senator. That's going to be really important to do. Write letters to the editor, get on news shows. The other day in Ottawa Radio, there was a wonderful interview with a retired public servant on the issue of sick leave, and he spoke so eloquently and movingly about the fact that he worked for the federal government for 30 years and never used a day of sick leave and returned all the accumulated sick leave because, of course, he doesn't, the federal government employees don't have the right to cash out sick leave on severance or retirement. And when asked, well, do you resent that? Do you resent the fact that you have to give back your sick leave that you accumulated? He said, absolutely not. I feel so blessed to have had good health. My coworkers, a lot of my coworkers have not been so lucky. Sick leave was a negotiated right, and it's ours, and it can't be taken away in the way that government is proposing to do so. So that kind of voice from a member and a retired member was just so important. We encourage you to tweet, post, and very importantly, stay in touch with others in the campaign and with the PSAC. You can do it by getting on the mailing list, going to weareallaffected.ca, www.weareallaffected.ca. You can sign up for the mailing list. And if you signed up for this webinar, then we have your emails, and we might be contacting you in the hope that you will stay on our mailing list so that we can continue this conversation in other ways. So, Victoria, that's it. Do we have anybody asking questions?
We don't have a lot of questions. One question we do have, and please do feel free to send me any questions you have or any clarifications, but in terms of the money collected through the RAND formula, the dues being used, not being able to be used for political work, we had a couple of questions around that, and one was, well, then what would the dues be used for? And so my response was that it would be for sort of pure representation and collective bargaining work. But are there other things? I mean, how would they discern, I guess, what's political and what isn't?
Yeah. Well, of course, we don't know because we haven't seen this legislation that's rumored to have already been drafted, and we don't exactly know what's being proposed. But we have some hints. In the United States, there are laws that require unions to raise funds completely separately from the dues collection for political action. And so there are procedures in place in the United States for monitoring and managing all of that. Now, of course, this is where Bill 377 fits in, because Bill 377, which was set in the Senate, if it becomes law and if we are successful in the legal challenges that we're going to mount against it, we will be required, all of us, local unions, national unions, every union in Canada will be required to give very detailed accounting and reporting of every penny that is spent. And so there's a possibility that some legislation would then draw on that information that's collected and it would fit in some way in Bill 377. The other thing I just want to point out is the private member's bill was introduced in the BC legislature by a Liberal backbencher. And that law could very well be a model for the kind of law that will be considered federally. And what that private member's bill proposed is that mandatory dues would restrict, so it would not say what a union can't do, but what it says is what a union can spend money on. So that really does kind of answer the question, what would be legitimate spending? Well, anything related to the negotiation of a collective agreement, anything related to the administration of agreements, of the collective agreement, like the processing of grievances. In the BC law that was introduced, there would be also provisions for spending money on appeals related to the interpretation of collective agreement. What would not be allowed, for example, is making representations on a piece of legislation like Bill 377 or Bill C-525 or laws that representations around issues like minimum wage or unemployment insurance or Medicare or any other benefits or social benefits that aren't directly human rights. Anything that is not directly related to language in a collective agreement. So we don't, like I say, we don't know for this for sure, but that's probably the kind of model that they're looking at.
Okay. So I've gotten a couple of questions that are related, and they are about the fact that the employer has recently put a lot of emphasis on value and ethics and has technically warned members to refrain from media comments will face the consequences. And another question that was related to that was my department is monitoring my web presence and the question just went down, and introduced internet behaviors, but I cannot speak out about issues. So In terms of members of the Federal Public Service speaking out against all of this, what risks are they taking? What suggestions do you have?
Yeah. Well, we have actually a document that might be helpful to addressing some of those about what your rights are. We've put together as part of the materials for this campaign, and these are all available for downloading from the website from weareallaffected.ca on what your rights are as a union member with respect to carrying out union activity or activity as a union member. And and the other thing I would say is, if you have any concerns or doubts about what you can do, the best thing to do is to get in touch with your local executive, your steward, or your component representatives, or your PSAC rep. We've been hearing a lot of this, that there really feels that there's a big crackdown happening, a real crackdown on dissent. And there is, of course, a crackdown in dissent. And one of the reasons, of course, that unions are under attack is that unions are one of the few organizations left these days in Canada that have the funds to be able to organize and speak out in opposition to the government. But as a union member, you also have protection. And so it's important that we not get so intimidated that we shut down, because that's exactly what they're looking for. So I would refer you to the list of what you can do and what you can't do with respect to, for example, wearing a button or distributing literature or speaking out in these issues. And never forget that you're also a citizen. And as a citizen, you can certainly write to members of Parliament, and you can certainly make your views known to your elected representatives.
So speaking of that, there's another question around, and this was raised in the last webinar too, around templates for letters to MPs, and so I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, we do have a system through the PSAC website where you can write a letter to your MP, and we can also formulate sort of form letters that can be used to send. And the suggestion was made in the last webinar, as Victoria said, that we develop some templates around, probably specifically around the private members' bills. And we are going to take up that suggestion and get that through. But I also just want to point out that a phone call, an email, personal email, a personal handwritten message to a constituency office or to your member of Parliament at the House of Commons, which, by the way, doesn't require postage, is much more effective than a machine-generated form letter. But yeah, with respect to how to make the arguments, one of the reasons for this webinar was to be able to explain some of the arguments, right, that we would want to use in arguing certainly against legislation that undermines collective bargaining rights, including the rent formula.
Okay, and I have one other question here, and then we may wrap up because we want to respect the time frame. But just a clarification, really, it says if members opted out of paying dues, would they also then opt out of the right to representation? Or are they saying that they may opt out of dues but still have the right to representation? So just to clarify that point, if you could.
Right. Again, we haven't seen a piece of legislation, so we can't answer this for sure. But what I can say is that no conservative, no employer organization has ever suggested that the legal obligation of unions to represent all members of the bargaining unit would be taken away. In other words, the assumption that we're operating and that everybody's operating is that if the RAND formula was taken away, the union would still be required legally to represent members of the bargaining unit, workers in the bargaining unit who are not paying dues. And in the United States, in the right to work under the so-called right-to-work legislation, that's exactly the situation. The union continues to be legally obligated to provide representation, but there is no mechanism to get members to pay for that representation. So, yeah.
And I've got a couple of just the last few minute questions coming in here. So one was asking if we can get a list of MPs and senators' contact information on the website with information on it on how to contact them. And I think if it's not there, it sure should be. And so yes would be the answer to that. Somebody else commented that at a recent conference they were told directly by an MP that form letters are not terribly effective. So just sort of reinforcing what you said, that a phone call or a personally written letter has more impact. And then there's a question about, do senators have the right to vote against Bill C-377? So what's the legislative process there?
Well, it's a private member's bill, and so the Senate can actually defeat a bill that's a private member's bill because it's not government policy. And it wouldn't be a vote of, whatever the equivalent would be of a non-confidence vote in the government, because it's not a government law, proposed law. The problem is that if the Senate does defeat the bill, all that happens is it goes back to the House of Commons for reconsideration, and of course the Conservatives have the majority. It's unlikely to be defeated in the Senate because although one Conservative senator, Hugh Segal, is actively speaking out against the bill and organizing against the bill, and so far I don't think he's been thrown out of caucus for doing so, the Conservatives have the majority in the Senate. But what they can do is continues the debate, and that's what as of a few hours ago. The Senate, I just saw sort of a media flash thing that the Senate has said that they will keep the debate going, so it can be delayed, and there is no question it's going to be challenged, and it's not only going to be challenged legally by the union, by the labor movement. It'll be challenged by other voices. I just want to say that half the provinces made submissions to the Senate arguing against this law because for jurisdictional and constitutional reasons, in addition to other reasons. So, and just the question that came up that we didn't answer that some people might be curious about is, do private members' bill like C-525 die on the order paper through a summer recess? And the answer is no, they don't. Bill 525 will be back for debate and move forward for second and reading and go to committee in September when the House reconvenes. And I noticed, I don't know, Victoria, if all these questions are showing up on your chat line, but there's some incredibly good points and questions. I don't know if everybody can feel it. There's
no, I don't see any of those.
One of the questions was what would happen to equity groups and how could the PSAC be able to lobby for those issues. That's exactly an excellent point. Unions have always advocated for equality, not just equality rights for union members, but equality rights for citizens. And that's exactly the kind of political work, or what they would call social justice work, that unions have been engaged in, that the Conservatives want to stop, and organizations like Merit Canada want us to stop, because we are a voice that champions those who suffer discrimination, and we are a voice for social justice, and it incenses them. It drives the Conservatives absolutely crazy that unions are an organized voice to speak on behalf of citizens around these questions and these issues.
Great. So we've gotten a few more requests wanting to know where we can get this information. So in terms of people wanting to get the information, I want to remind people that this webinar has been recorded, and so if you have other members who would have liked to have been here, who couldn't be, or who you think should hear about this, you'll be able to. It won't be posted tomorrow on the website, but it will be posted within the week on the website. So you will have that. There also are going to be 2 webinars done en français in the next week or so. So we'll also have those up on the website as well, and we will indeed try and make the information available. We've got lots of requests around what you can and cannot do in the workplace, so that document should be posted for sure. In terms of the slides, I've been asked by a couple of people around whether the slides are going to be available just by themselves, PowerPoint available. I don't know what your thoughts are on that because, of course, the PowerPoint is just slides and it's the information that goes with it that's in your head, Morna. It's also very valuable. So just to say that other people have asked, could there be more webinars? And I would say yes, this is a format that is quite straightforward for us to be able to do. And we've had over 100, probably 150 people, close to 150 people tonight just hearing this, and it's a great way to reach people, so we will do it again for sure.
Yeah, for sure. There is a way, actually, Victoria, but I don't know that we can do this, so maybe I shouldn't do it, but we can actually send you down, you can figure, I don't know if you know how to do this.
I do not know how to do this.
Then maybe
my third webinar that I posted, but
what we can do is we could post the PowerPoint on the website, or we can send it to everybody who's registered in the webinar. If that, and there are some presenter notes that so it's not entirely in my head. There's some sort of cheat notes that you can then get access to that I've done up, and I can expand on those before we send them out. I'm glad some people anyway thought this was helpful, and we really want suggestions of other material that would be useful. We know a number of you and a lot of other people are doing this campaigning work. They're going out and talking to coworkers. It is not easy work to do, and a number of campaigners and people doing this work are calling out for sort of more resources, more help. We're trying to respond to all those requests. Those of you who are not what we're calling campaigners, official campaigners, but are willing to sort of take the plunge and go and speak to coworkers about some of these issues and try to get pledge cards signed. We have a workshop, a 3-hour workshop for campaigners that's available and offered through your region, PSAC regional offices, and we're also going to be doing some online training down the road, right, Victoria?
Yes,
we're working on that. So lots of tips on how to approach members, how to speak to members about these issues. And I just, for any of you who are maybe a little bit sort of reluctant about going out and speaking to members, I think you should really draw hope from this survey, this recently concluded survey of PSAC members. There is very, very strong support among PSAC membership for their collective agreement rights and for collective bargaining and for the PSAC as their union. Obviously, there's lots of things that need to be fixed in the union, and a lot of members have issues and upsets about things that supervisors do, and that includes some of the things the union does. But the best way for us to start addressing those issues and starting to fix problems is to go out and speak to members and talk to them face to face. And that work is best done by other workers, co-workers in the workplace. The survey says to us a couple of really interesting things. Members, the people they trust the most, members trust more than anybody else on issues, their local leaders, their co-workers. And another important thing is they want to hear. PSAC members are crying out for contact with their union. They want it, especially by email, which is one of the reasons we're collecting email addresses on these pledge cards, because they want regular communication by email, but most of all, they want it face-to-face. So if you go out there and talk to members and you're worried about how you're going to get received, everything is suggesting that you're going to be welcomed. There might be some tough conversations, right? There might be a lot of questions about, well, what went wrong here, but mostly people want to hear and they want to have that discussion. So any help you can give doing that work would be just huge. That's how we're going to build a union, and that's how we're going to make sure that workers' rights are not just protected, but expanded in the future. Not just, and also for future generations. We've got to think about these next generations. We have to. This will be the first generation. Our generation is workers. It's the first generation that looks like it's going to be better off than our kids' generation. And we have an opportunity to turn that around and change that.
That is a great, I have one other question. That's such a great way to end, but I see a question here that I think is an important one to us around transparency, and I just saw it here, and the question was, can a union member request a balance sheet from the union? We're talking about spending and what the union spends money on and that sort of thing. What are the members' rights around knowing how the union is spending money? And then I think we will wrap it up after that, because I know people have places to go, people to see.
For the PSAC spending and financial statements and budget, those are all dealt with in a very open way at PSAC conventions. All that information is public. So, if members are asking for that information, then they should put the question. And I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the so-called ammunition or evidence that conservative members of Parliament are using to show that unions are somehow misspending money on social justice issues, those very conservative members are getting all the information about spending from the PSAC website, among other public sources. So it's kind of interesting how transparent and available the information is to the public. So, yeah. There's lots of information about how the union spends its money.
Great. Good stuff. Well, I think we will wrap it up there. I'd like to thank you all again for participating. We had over 50 participants on the call, which is just wonderful, and we will indeed have other webinars and make sure that they are well advertised, because it seems like it's a great way to reach a lot of people across the country at once, which is super. So thanks very much, everybody. Take care, and we will be in touch for sure.
Thank you.